Hello, I am thrilled to be here. Muy feliz de estar aquí, pero muy contenta que no lo tengo que hacer en español, como otras veces Guillermo me ha obligado a hacer. So this is a paper that is in review, hopefully with a good path. And I thought it was a very topical paper because of what is happening in the world right now with COVID. And it is the story of how my home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, dealt with COVID using data. They actually did very well. We were fortunate that our governor was also a physician, so he believed in data-driven decision making, but it didn't come out of thin air. They actually had dealt with another crisis, which was the opioid crisis. So in this paper, we investigate how these two shocks forced Virginia to become more resilient and what roles data played in this. So the dashboard that you're looking at right here is a dashboard that shows the hospital capacity in all of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Imagine the scene. It is March 2020. We are watching what is happening in Lombardy, in Italy, in New York City, and states everywhere are running to build overflow facilities to their hospitals to be able to keep up with the surge of patients and the surge of needed ventilators for their state to make sure that they had the capacity. This dashboard shows the patients, and this is through time, so you're looking at April 1st through March 1st, 2021. The capacity is at the very top. So you see that just a part of the bed, this particular graph is about the beds. Just a little section was being used by COVID patients. So there was plenty of capacity. There was no need to build overflow facilities, which were very costly. Instead, the Commonwealth used that money to invest in testing and later to invest in vaccination facilities. Here's another graph that shows ventilators. Again, there was never a demand for ventilators. The state was never overburdened with the need for ventilators. So again, they could use their resources and focus on testing and later vaccination. So this is a great saving for the state, for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So what we talk about in our paper is how do institutions accomplish digital resilience, right? So digital resilience, we learned through studying this case, this longitudinal case that started with the opioid crisis in Virginia and ended and is still ongoing with COVID, is that it didn't happen during the shocks. Digital resilience is constructed during a period that we call the interlude between shocks. So it's this golden period between shocks when organizations, or in our state, in our case, a government, takes what they have learned from the initial shock and exercises what we call their resilience muscle by gathering performance data, enacting procedures, and building the infrastructure that create this atmosphere where sense of responsiveness and learning happens. And these are the three main constructs of our paper. So though you may see digital resilience as an institutional muscle, we find that data are the protein that build digital resilience to survive a shock. So how is digital resilience created? Well, we find that digital resilience is created through three main phases. First of all, sensing. So an organization's ability to recognize and be aware of a pending disruption due to an exogenous shock. Second, they respond. How responsive are they? What is their ability to respond in a time of crisis or to bounce back from exogenous shocks with minimal effects? Now, of course, there is going to be effects. We're not saying they're going to be unaffected, but they are going to try to minimize the effects. And finally, during this interlude, they learn. So they engage in transformative actions, and they come out of the shock strengthened and more resourceful. So when we talk about sensing, what do we mean? Sensing has several pieces. So with sensing, we have two parts. First is detection. So can we assess the vulnerability and potential changes that are coming from this exogenous shock? And can we recognize and interpret? So do we have the ability to recognize the risk and problem solve on the fly in the face of increasing uncertainty? You know, certainly if as we think of COVID, we really had no idea what was coming downstream from us. Second of all, responsiveness has three parts. The availability of resources. So the ability to accumulate assets and resources, and in our case, data assets. The ability to communicate and coordinate. So give data and data sharing, in our case, gave the ability to managers and various agencies and locations that are all stakeholders, but not necessarily part of the Commonwealth of Virginia, the ability to coordinate their actions. And then improvisation and adaptability. What does this mean? The ability to manage resources and reconfigure them into other resources. And this is what's amazing about data, right? We can take data, and very often one data asset plus another data asset does not equal two. It equals much more than that, because now this information together gives a fuller picture. So in the example that I opened the presentation with, when the Florida Hospital Association shared its data with the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is what created that dashboard, suddenly Virginia had an entire view of the state and knew that they were actually okay as far as resources in the hospitalization of COVID patients, and that they could invest time and money and resources towards testing and vaccination. And then learning, actually improvisation and adaptability is a big part. So you need to be able to reconfigure your resources and be agile to develop specific resources. And data assets are specifically very good for this, right? Because if you have the information at hand and various agencies are able to communicate on what is happening, then you can improvise and adapt quickly. Think of 9/11. One of the issues at 9/11 was that agencies weren't sharing data, even though they were all part of the federal government. They were not sharing data, and they weren't able to respond very quickly. And finally, there's this learning and what we call a sort of a golden period after or when the shock or the exogenous shock is under control. Then you take some time to reflect on the crisis situation, and then incorporate that new insight into a knowledge base. And once you've reflected on this information, then you need to be able to assimilate it. And that means that you don't forget. The shock may be better or under control, but you don't forget what happened, and you change some of the existing procedures, and you adapt for future challenges. So this is the sort of overarching framework that we used. Now, we relied on resource-based view of the firm to help us explain what is happening. So in our case, our resources were things such as the Office of the Chief Data Officer, which happened about halfway through our case study, where the Commonwealth decided that there need to be a centralized person in charge of sort of policing and navigating the data traffic, so that all parties would be in agreement of sharing data, and they felt comfortable giving their information. He created something called the Data Trust, which was the technical infrastructure that allowed for data sharing, and a data governance framework. These are all resources that were created by the Commonwealth, an executive data board that agreed on when and how and who could look at data and what data could be shared and how it would be shared and how it would be de-identified, and a data governance council that made sure the data was always being used correctly. And then these data trust agreements, and this was a key thing, and later I'll talk about this, that allowed the Commonwealth to execute data trust agreements very, very quickly. When our story started, when we're talking about opioid, it would take sometimes months to execute a data trust agreement, and now they were being executed in a couple hours. The combination of these resources, right? If you think about Barney's RBV paper, he proposes that firms possess resources which are configured to create capabilities. The capabilities, in turn, create a value proposition. In our case, that value proposition is resilience. And we operationalize that resilience in the form of economic impact to the Commonwealth and crisis and damage mitigation, okay? So when you look at the capabilities that we created, there are those three things that I described earlier: sensing, responding, and learning capabilities. So learning comes a little bit after, okay? So although RBV is generally deployed to explain what leads some business organizations to be more competitive than others, Barney et al. Clarifies that a firm is defined broadly as any strategic entity involved in creating economic and allocating economic value. So in our case, we are talking about a state government. These resources, capabilities, and value propositions are robust RBV constructs that have been applied in government institutions. So for example, to examine how creating entrepreneurship and investment capabilities, to develop training and consulting capabilities, provide a livelihood scheme for the citizens, and how prosperity is a value proposition for citizens. So when it comes to resilience, it's important to understand how these resources coalesce to form capabilities and who pushes the resources together and how they are held together. So if I go to my next slide, you'll see sort of our case study. So we are looking at two shocks in the Commonwealth. The first one was the opioid crisis. For those of you not familiar with what is happening to quite a bit of the United States, there has been an epidemic of addiction. It started out with opioid, but it's moved on to many other drugs. And it's been traumatic. It is destroying towns, and a certain section of Virginia has really felt that. And it was detected in the Commonwealth that the opioid use was growing, and it was having effects to our healthcare systems and causing deaths and employment issues, right? So the first shock is opioid, and they went through the stages that we describe in accumulating assets, that is the response part of it. And I'm not going to go into detail. Hopefully this paper will be published and you can read. They found ways to communicate and coordinate, and they found ways to improvise and adapt. And a lot of these were legislated. I will go into our propositions towards the end. Unless in a government, unless these things are legislated, they're not going to happen. And that's a fortunate thing of a government, right? They can actually legislate that that data be shared, but they cannot legislate that private organizations share their data, such as the Virginia Hospital Association, which they were actually able to get to participate. So then they this learn is that golden period, and then that was very crucial because they understood how to create a data governance framework, right, as they were handling the opioid crisis. They hired the chief data officer, who is actually a co-author of our paper, Carlos Rivero. They created a pilot called FACT, which allowed for not just the sharing of data, but the creation of several dashboards that could be used by state agencies and their stakeholders. And they created the workforce referral, all based on how the difficulties that they had with data sharing while dealing with the opioid crisis. I'll give you an example. The police department needed to know where folks were getting their opioids. The social justice systems were scared to share the data with police departments because they were worried that they would go after the people that had addictions, but that's not really what the police were after. They were really after who was dealing the drugs so that they could stop the source, right? So there was a lot of negotiation and agreement on how the data would be used and what were the purposes of the data. And we had several examples like that. And then that was once this was assimilated, they actually passed a state statute that actually amended how data was collected in Virginia. Believe it or not, there was actually laws that prohibited the combination of data, and really in a way to protect the citizens, but it became sort of a barrier. And this infrastructure and these agreements allowed Virginia to then react very quickly to COVID because they had a holistic whole view of what was happening in the state. So they were able to use the infrastructure from the data governance and from FACT, this data portal, and immediately start pulling data in that had to do with healthcare and the information that you would need to deal with a pandemic. And they did this now way faster for COVID than they did for opioid. And I'll have a couple of examples coming up. So here is an example of sort of this resource assimilation and reconfiguration to create capabilities. Okay, so this is a case of opioid. Now I have to premise this with the fact that opioid has actually gotten way worse again. COVID was a terrible thing for people with addictions. It basically meant isolation, which is the worst thing that you can do to a person that is dealing with addiction, unfortunately. So we do report these numbers in our paper, but you see sort of like this drop and then this like increase that brought the overdose numbers to bigger than before. So this is a really unfortunate fact of COVID. Of COVID and addiction. So we've got these resources. We've got the chief data officer who's now sort of policing and organizing and being the central voice of data sharing. We've got the technical infrastructure called FACT. We've got data from hospitals. Now, mind you, the hospitals are private organizations. They did not have to share with the state, but the state now had the right data share agreements that made people comfortable and trusting of sharing data. And then we had data from law enforcement. So this is just one example, but I want to run you through this framework. So they started to detect spike in overdoses in a certain stage. And they realized when they looked at these spikes that they were fentanyl laced. So this is potent heroin added to the opioid. And it almost always means a fatal overdose. So, however, this time they had information available for multiple agencies. So police or law enforcement was seeing the hospital numbers. They were seeing fatal overdoses happening very quickly, right? So they were able to respond very quickly. So they actually, this is a municipality within Virginia, put out a press release to the community saying, and they said, look, there is fentanyl-laced opioids out there. You need to be careful. If your loved ones have addiction, you need to check with them because this will be fatal. And they also worked with law enforcement in finding the source, okay? And this allowed them to improvise and make adjustments to prevent further harm. And it ended up with those lethal overdoses being stopped. So you saw this peak in lethal overdoses and then a sudden drop for the next 3 or 4 months. They reflected upon this, right? And so they made adjustments to prevent further harm. And they did this by expanding this to other regions of Virginia that are dealing with opioid crisis. And here is an example from COVID. Okay, so again, we have very similar resources. We have a chief data officer, we've got the technical infrastructure and FACT, data from hospital, and now data from local health departments, okay? So in this case, they're detecting a spike in COVID cases in Virginia, but they're all coming from the same region, which is the Hampton Roads, which is where my university happens to be. It's a very hot tourist place. It's got a beach, it's got Virginia Beach, it's got Colonial Williamsburg. People were getting antsy. It's June, they're tired of being locked in their houses. But the governor recognizes this problematic. He first increased testing and reporting. And now he had testing results and hospital bed availability. And he said, we actually are getting dangerously close to overloading our hospitals in that area. And we are seeing a spike in positive cases of COVID. So he shut down not all of the Commonwealth, but just that region. So he increased the restrictions just for that region, but not the rest of the Commonwealth, which can be very impactful from an economic perspective. So we actually show numbers in that paper where the rest of Virginia economically, and we looked specifically at restaurants and hotels and places where people would do commerce, the numbers stayed constant in the rest of the Commonwealth. You saw a big drop in the Hampton roads, but the rest of the state did well. So it had a strong economic output, and we saw tax revenue not only stay constant, but increase in the other regions. We also saw a decline in COVID cases overall in the Commonwealth. So again, they now make adjustments to prevent further infections. And this adjustment was to realize that you can do data-driven decision-making to have a resilient reaction to something like this and minimize the economic impact to the Commonwealth and to the increase of COVID cases. So we have 4 propositions that come out of the whole paper. The first proposition comes at right at the beginning of our story when the Commonwealth is first dealing with opioid. They realized that several data sharing concerns and constraints, such as information security, regulatory restriction, data ownership and control, infrastructure's cost, transparency, citizen consent, and data quality, accuracy, and integrity were going to be problematic. So they commissioned a report, and this report made 3 recommendations. They said, first of all, we need open data accessibility and utilization by state agencies. Second, we need to establish a data sharing governance that calls for ethical use, but authority to use this data. And then finally, that there was a need to implement data and analytics projects to promote the new digital economy in the Commonwealth. And although these recommendations of the report aspired a data-driven and resilient COVA, in practice, these resources help build resilience that would have procured, constructed, and organized well before sense and response capabilities needed to be built. However, there was still not one single entity in charge for addressing this. And so what the state was learning is that the state would be well served by a single, neutral, trusted entity that could coordinate data gathering, agreements among data owners, provide secure data storage, and build relationships to facilitate data gathering. And this led to our first proposition, that data sharing, a necessary practice for digital resilience, will take place when bureaucratic barriers are removed and data owners are protected by legislation that allows them to share the data. The second proposition has to do with what happened once Virginia started to get the opioid crisis under control. They didn't solve it. It didn't get a lot better, but it didn't get worse, okay? And this is what we mean by resilience, because these are big shocks, right? As they got this under control, they reflected on the successes they had had and the failures that they had, and they synthesized it and assimilated it into the state in the form of hiring a chief data officer and creating the technical infrastructure needed and the data sharing agreements needed. So that's our second proposition. Organizations build resilience muscle during the interlude when they reflect upon successes and failures from across the organization and assimilate learning, okay? During the use of data in COVID, we learned that data trust and governance frameworks were key drivers for driving the various agencies together to get services to citizens up and running. The groundwork for data provisioning and drafting of flexible agreements during their interlude sped up the creation of customizable dashboards so decision makers could respond to the shock in a timely manner. So state governments cannot serve their residents if they're paralyzed by the shock, right? And furthermore, constituents cannot make responsible decisions if they're not empowered with data, intelligence, and insights, which comes to our third propositions. Organizations are more resilient when they select data and digital technologies to design interventions and induce slack, such that resources, people, equipment, and funds can be efficiently and effectively deployed. And what do we mean by slack? It means it's a little bit different than supply chain slack in the sense that I have limited amount of resources and I create an environment where I'm not wasting resources. I've got some flexibility to use my resources driven by data, by evidence on where my resources are best used. Finally, the ongoing participation that was contingent upon continued trust and knowledge that that data was being properly shared. The governor of Virginia put out several executive orders to publish the results of a statewide data asset inventory. So they created an environment where anybody actually, but mostly Virginia residents can go in and collect data. In fact, I signed several of my data visualization projects out of the Virginia Data Trust, and they had different levels of security, right? So anything my students downloaded was de-identified, but there also was a very efficient and quick way to request data assets with an almost immediate approval or disapproval of the request, which meant that data began flowing throughout the Commonwealth, and agencies started to create value-added applications for all sorts of things. So they created a workforce development portal. When COVID happened, people could not go apply for unemployment or look for work in person, but they created platforms that allowed people to do this digitally and help them and track these people to see if they were successful. So all sorts of like really positive and well-executed data-driven initiatives. Once this data became flowing, agencies created value-added applications by combining validated data and leveraging the crosswalk table that existed that allowed them to say, okay, these data assets can be combined and these cannot. So there was an entire data dictionary. It's really fascinating infrastructure. So our fourth proposition is that data sharing agreements, legislation, and compliance regulations must build flexibility to rapidly adapt under environmental changes and technological advances. So finally, what do we think our contributions are? First of all, RBV is the resource-based view, is a useful theoretical lens to consider how resilience is built with resources and how technology infrastructure and data resources coalesce to build these capabilities that create digital resilience. However, current research in RBV is generally silent about the mechanisms of how these resources come together. Because after all, resources are for the most part intangible or inanimate and don't move by themselves. So RBV cites mobility as a characteristic of the resources, but it doesn't give a lot of detail. Who pushes these resources to become capabilities? What is the glue that binds the resources? These questions are especially important when the required capabilities are uncertain, such as the capability to remain resilient during a disaster. So how do these resources coalesce and who will control the resources? And how do we get the people that control the resources to be willing to give up the resources? So when the state government builds capabilities for resilience to shock, there is little in terms of residual claims, blunting the risk of a loss. So the most desirable outcome is the status quo. There's no tangible value proposition of increasing sale and process. So here, the value proposition is risk mitigation. Also, our findings contribute to expanding RBV's relevance to the capability of risk mitigation and the mechanisms that enable or impede digital resilience. Our work contributes to understanding the mechanisms and the actors who push the resources towards capabilities. We anticipate that our case study finding will advance the formation of metrics and the calibration of resources and capabilities that create digital resilience. So what are these metrics? How do you measure digital resilience? In our case, we demonstrated how digital enhancement can help an organization achieve digital resilience by improving how they sense, the capabilities of sensing, responding, and learning. And sensing capabilities may include measures that capture how quickly organizations sense and interpret a shock. So for example, research could use the number of days it took key decision makers to anticipate or realize that there was a shock. Researchers may assess responsiveness by measuring the effectiveness of decisions and outcomes. For example, in our paper, we measured Virginia's successful response by tracking tax revenues as a metric of a value proposition. So the tax revenues in Virginia actually went up during COVID. Future research might capture relief cash flow to residents, volume of services assessed by residents to measure the government's resilience, or customer retention or supply chain metrics for commercial firms to trace them back to decisions made during the shock that influence these metrics. Response capability could also be measured by the time needed to arrive at the decision during a crisis and the role of data sharing, integration, dissemination, and facilitating decision making. The metrics that are needed to capture how digital enhancement can help by capturing enduring organizational change after a shock. So for example, Meyer, in a sort of influential paper from 1982, examined learning by asking administrator 2 questions. What did you learn from the shock? And what enduring organizational change has resulted? Organizational learning was measured in that paper by counting the number of words administrators used in answering these 2 questions. This method can be enhanced with emergent text mining techniques to capture themes and topics from emails and documentation during the shock. Digital assets provide an opportunity to capture usage metric, right? Because it's data. So we can actually analyze that data. In our case, we looked at how many folks actually accessed the data sitting in the data trust and what agencies were using the data and how frequently were they using the data and how often they asked for help from the Commonwealth for consulting. And we saw those numbers tick up, telling us that they are actually not only being more resilient, but also actually requesting more use of the data. So that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have. I think that this has the ability to really impact how we think about resilience in organizations as well. In our case, we looked at a state agency, but this could be true for an organization, for a city, and as how we think of how data assets can help organizations or cities or governments sense, respond, and learn. Muchas gracias, obrigado, and see you at the conference.
Thank you so much. What a great presentation. Very useful. I can see that she's already shaking Virginia too, just as you did in Florida. Awesome presentation. Do we have any questions? You can please raise your hand.
Monica, it's not a question directly. It's just to say that we had some more people watching us from YouTube. And for those that are watching us from YouTube, if you have questions, just write them down there, and I'll be able to throw them here. I don't know. A WhatsApp message came in front of me right when I was talking, so I don't know if you cut what I was saying, but I was just saying that whoever is watching us through YouTube can also ask questions to Monica directly here. We've all been challenged by these situations in which we have the data, but we don't know if we have the good data, and all of our politicians are always trying to use the data towards their own interests in ways that we don't even trust the data any longer. seems that Alfredo has a question there.
Yeah, hi, Monica. Thank you, Alexandra. Quick question. The Commonwealth and Virginia just instituted GDPR laws with regard to privacy on data. Do you think that's going to affect the academic side of gathering data and maybe have some influence with respect to what some of the findings you had in your research?
Potentially, but honestly, the data trust agreements that they formed take into account several infrastructures for data security. For example, HIPAA, and what is the one for academic data? I don't know why I can't think of that standard, but all of those are taken into consideration in the creation of the data trust agreements. So it's actually a really interesting interface. You log on, and you have a metadata repository and data dictionary that shows you all the data assets. And you can combine the pieces that you want to look at, and the agreements take into account what is shareable and what is not shareable because of certain things like HIPAA and GDPR now. And it runs up the chain of command also through the data sharers themselves. So they may also decide that that is not shareable data. I'll give you an example. The Virginia Hospital Association was concerned, that very first example that I gave where they were looking at capacity, they were concerned that folks that don't understand how hospitals run would misinterpret the data. So one of the caveats that they had in their data is that they wanted to be present when that data was interpreted because they wanted to help interpret that data. So it's a pretty robust data sharing agreement. There's still issues, by the way. I mean, I tell a very rosy story. We don't tell such a rosy story in the paper. There was a lot of hiccups. This whole story started in 2012. So there's been a lot of learning that has happened to get the Commonwealth to this position. I don't know if I answered your question. But.
No, just I just want to see if there's any potential impacts in the future, because that may be a potential area that I'm looking at with regard to GDPR and privacy.
Be glad to follow up. Carlos is a co-author on this paper, and he's the Chief Data Officer of Virginia, so he might have some more insight into this.
Great, thank you.
Monica, I was curious about the comparison because it seems that the state there is very into, promoting this and the extent to which they can accomplish, this kind of outcome, and basically for COVID and get that to have an impact. It's very impressive. How do you compare, that level of involvement or the regulations that may hinder or facilitate the progress of these initiatives compared to Florida, for example, with the health records project that you were involved in?
So I was involved with the health information exchanges, and they've really struggled. But we saw those very similar struggles in Virginia. They're not that different. Mm-hmm. I would say that Virginia just maybe got a little bit of a head start because they started with this opioid crisis. And I don't know that it came through clearly in my paper, but the opioid crisis started way before COVID. COVID hit about the middle of the opioid crisis. So they had already learned all these things. So I'll give you an example. There was a state legislator who we interviewed who was very pro sharing data. And at that point, he was trying to share data because of a demand from the government. Right when Obama had been elected, there was going to be some federal funds, and they were worried that people could double dip. So it wasn't even the same concern that they could get data from several resources and maybe double dip into how much money they got. So he tried to pass some legislature that allowed data sharing between agencies, but there was actually laws in place that did not allow it, and for a good reason, because there are times that you don't want data assets combined because they could be used against the citizen, right? So you might be applying for a loan, but you've already, like you had some sort of crime and you've already paid your time. Maybe you don't want that data shared, right? So it was an upstream battle. So the very first version of the law that started to put into place these data sharing agreements was knocked down because somebody in the legislature went as far as saying that helicopters were going to come down into your house and take your things. It got like really politicized, like we see in Florida as well. But this was maybe 6 or 7 years. And I think another sort of interesting thing about Virginia is that Virginia has to be resilient because a governor can only be governor for 4 years. So the government is constantly changing, which has forced state agencies to be very resilient to changes in who's governing, right? So it's made them a little more used to having to deal with changes. In fact, we're about to change governors again in Virginia. A lot of this is very political, not to take one side or the other, but it's one thing that I think Carlos has done really well is that he's depoliticized all of this. If politics ever come up, he just ignores it, and he states over and over what the goal is, right? Like, so for example, they share education data. So they want to see if we intervene, like if we are giving college degrees, how many people are placing and where can we best help? So he's always showing these kind of goalposts that have no politics behind them, which I think is a very wise move.
That's a great lesson for Florida. Nice, thank you.
May I ask a question, Monica? Because when you say that, of course, you and your co-author try to check, to look at this in a very depoliticized way, but we always think about the politicians, right? And we always think them as being at the other side, and we are the right citizens, and they are the bad politicians. But the fact is that there is really a huge concern with respect to who takes ownership of data that citizens share through, just these days, just through living, right? And I don't know if I understand how we can depoliticize something, because each one of us is already a political, let's say, entity, and we are all concerned when it's people that think like we do, that are in power. We think that it's good that they have the data, but when it's the people that think differently to us, then we think that it's horrible. How will we be able to deal with this in the future? Just from the perspective of someone who's studying this issue specifically.
So you make a really valid point, and I'll give you an example. Early in COVID, the police wanted to know when overdoses were happening, and social services, a completely different agency, did not want to share with criminal justice and the police, because they were worried that they would come after the drug users or the people who are drug dependent, and not necessarily do anything to stop the people dealing. So this is where a person like Carlos Rivera, a chief data officer, like you would think he's a really techie person, and you notice he's not a CIO. He's not the chief information officer. He's the chief data officer, and he does a lot of negotiating, right? So he goes to them and he says, look, police, what are you going to use this data for? And they said, actually, we want to go after who's dealing. We want to find the source of this. And we also want to use it to stop overdoses. And we're going to leave drug offenders alone. Once these agreements are sort of created, then there's the trust sort of formed. And it's like case by case, and it's constantly getting negotiated. Right when COVID hit, the Commonwealth of Virginia went to the Virginia Hospital Association and said, we need your data. And they're like, you're not going to use it, right? We're not going to give it to you, right? But because they had already created sort of this infrastructure for data sharing, where they're able to show them, look, we've got a crosswalk, we've got ways to de-identify the data, we have ways to keep the data secure, this is how we're going to use it, this is where we're going to put it. They had already done the legwork. They were able to negotiate much quicker than they did with the police department, like just 3 years before.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Monica, I think that what you're sharing, it's very, very valuable about, it's like the dynamics of, it's that soft side of getting this to work. I mean, the technical is so easy, like it's how
there's zero technical problems.
Yeah. Awesome.
We saw the same, Gladys, at the health information exchanges in Florida, right? We had the infrastructure was up and running. We were told that a hospital could onboard in 3 weeks, and the first one took 2 years. Because of these data sharing agreements and these concerns, valid concerns, by the way. We are not saying that these concerns are not valid. I mean, all it takes is one sort of change in political party, and it could then be, we heard a lot of in our interviews, we are worried that this data will be weaponized. We heard that over and over again.
Interesting. I guess over time, I want to hear the story from you. What can be done to prevent that? There should be maybe some kind of overall framework, because this tool should be, and look at what you're accomplishing here. I mean, this will be very, very valuable. And we need to somehow get over those clear burdens. I think the legal framework or something is not there yet to make it, to facilitate, you know.
I mean, I paint, I think, a pretty rosy story, which in the first revision of this paper, they kind of picked up, and they're like, okay, you guys are way too positive. There's resilience isn't that you do it perfectly. Resilience is that you avoid catastrophe. So for example, when vaccinations, when we started to organize for vaccinations in Virginia, it was a hot mess. In the background, Carlos is telling us about this. Like local municipalities are keeping their own data. The state is trying to figure out what's happening. They don't involve Carlos's office till the end. So the chief data officer has no idea. Then he gets pulled into an emergency meeting. They're like, it's bad. We don't know who's getting us. We don't know. We just don't have the numbers. He quickly is able to aggregate data and fix it. To the citizen, we can't tell. It looks like it's going great. In fact, when Rajiv and I interviewed him, we're like, really? That happened? We thought we were doing so well. That's resilience, right? When the citizen, the ultimate stakeholder, doesn't see the chaos in the background, it means that the state is being resilient.
I think we have room for a couple more questions.
What's been really sad is sort of now we have shared data to see what's happened with the opioid crisis. It has gotten, and then what's a very new challenge for the opioid crisis is that now we have Narcan, which is good, which they can neutralize somebody who has overdosed pretty quickly, but we don't know that they have overdosed. There's no data, right? So the police show up and they give them a dose of Narcan, and now they don't even show up at the hospital. So we're not counting overdoses. So there's constantly challenges to this and collecting this data correctly.
Nice. How does it compare with other states? I mean,
so we did compare ourselves. That was one of the things that reviewers asked for, was for ourselves to. So we're comparable. I think we used Colorado and Connecticut as our comparisons, and and our dependent variable there was tax revenue. So we wanted to show that Virginia didn't tank in tax revenues, and we were comparable to the top performing states. But we weren't the only state that did well. There was other states that did well. We just captured the story because we happen to live here and have access to the data.
Great. Well, we are ahead of the game in the hospitalization. So go Florida.
I'm in Florida right now, so.
Yeah. Okay, well, so if we don't have any other questions, we have a panel coming up after this session. So we're gonna go ahead and thank you, Monica, once again for the wonderful presentation. I'll be very much looking forward to seeing how this work unfolds. It looks like it has a lot of potential, and I'm sure I'm going to be reading about this for several years to come. It seems like it's a pipeline of work coming streaming from this effort.
What's been super challenging, right, is when the revision came back, so much more happened. I mean, this story isn't over, and for us to figure out where to stop telling the story was a super, we stopped at right before vaccinations, because this is still ongoing. This might go on for 2 more years. So we're still studying what's happening, but the paper can't be that long.
But also I think the framework, the framework itself, it's very, even outside healthcare, I see like the framework, it's very interesting. I work in a government office with, just coordinating international cooperation for different projects. And I like the way you set up the RBB, the framework, and how it goes. It's really very interesting, very interesting. I think that the design piece of that, like, which is your area, is obviously going to be very useful and very applicable probably to our areas outside the health informatics. So
Thank you, Gladys.
thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe some people that have cameras there can open their cameras to show more that we were here watching her talk to us, right? Otherwise, you'll have that feeling that she was talking to just I don't know, people, zombies that are somewhere else, or are having a snack in the kitchen and will come here and they're all in their pajamas. See, the ones that are opening their cameras, they're all in their pajamas, I swear.
This reminds me a lot of teaching last year. So
yeah, I know there was
exactly that's our challenge all the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So we have this this panel, the gender in IT panel
interesting.
right after.
Okay.
You can keep in the room if you wish, or
okay.
you can, for a very quick snack, come back after a coffee at 3 o'clock. All right. Sorry, I should never say the time because each one has a different time here, right? But it's in 6 minutes from now. Okay.
Okay.
Gladys.
See you there. Thank you.
Thank you.